So it's a great pleasure to welcome Göran Finnveden to Researcher's Desk. Göran, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thanks for the invitation. I will talk about sustainable consumption and provide some insights and results from some finished and ongoing projects. And some of these projects have been fairly large, so there's been a lot of people involved. So what I'm going to present is based on results from many colleagues at KTH, but also in other universities and research institutes. I'm now working at KTH. I'm also currently the program director for the MISTRA Sustainable Consumption Program, which is one of the projects I will talk about. I'll start talking about this project called PRINCE, Policy Relevant Indicators for Consumption and Environment. And this was a project with the aim of developing indicators and methods for measuring the environmental impacts of Swedish consumption. And it was led by people from the Statistics Sweden, but involving researchers from KTH, Chalmers, SEI, and institutes in Norway and the Netherlands. So what we did in this project was, among other things, to develop what is now sometimes called the PRINCE model, which is now the model that is used for producing Swedish official statistics for consumption-based emissions of greenhouse gases. In this method, we are combining data from the system of environmental and economic accounts, which are produced by Statistics Sweden, with data from a multi-regional environmentally extended input-output analysis model. And I'll explain this a little bit more. We're combining data from the system of environmental and economic accounts produced by Statistics Sweden with data from a multi-regional environmental extended input-output analysis model. So what does this mean? Well, system of environmental and economic accounts is a fairly internationally standardized systems. There is guidelines from the United Nations and from Eurostat, etc. And Statistics Sweden is using this, and they are developing data each year annually for this. And the idea is here to use the system of economic accounts. So the economic accounts, that's the system that is used for developing all the economic indicators that we are used to, like the GDP, inflation, employment, etc. This is the system of economic accounts. But by also including environmental data in the same system, using the same system boundaries and type of sectors, etc., you can have environmental and economic data in the same system, and it makes it easier to compare environmental and economic data with each other. So this is done annually, and a part of the system of environmental accounts is the input-output analysis model. So what is that? Well, input-output analysis is an economic tool, and the heart of it is different matrices, supply and use matrices, etc., where on the axis of the matrix there are different sectors in society. For example, food production, agriculture, transportation services. And then in the different parts of the matrix, you fill out the numbers, how much monetary flows that goes between these different sectors. So, for example, for food production sector, they are obviously buying from the agriculture sector, but they are also buying from the transportation sector and basically all other sectors. And the transportation sector is in turn buying things. They are buying some food. For example, if we travel by train and go to the cafe and have some coffee, that's bought from the food sector. So all sectors are buying things from each other. And this is described in the input-output analysis. Having it environmentally extended, we also include environmental data in this. So then we are not only showing the monetary flows, but also the emissions from these different sectors. And in that way, we can also calculate not only what is bought from different sectors to produce a certain amount of food, for example, but also get some information about the environmental impacts from these different sectors that comes with this monetary exchange. And these input-output analysis models are typically done for a country at a time, but by having it multi-regional, we can also integrate how different countries or regions in the world are trading with each other. So then we can get not only information about the environmental emissions within a country, but also in other countries, which comes with the consumption in a specific country. So what was done in this project and what's the sort of core of the PRINCE model is then the combination, how to link the system of environmental and economic accounts, which is updated annually in Sweden, with a multi-regional input-output analysis model. That's some mathematics that goes into that part. And in this case, we used a multi-regional input-output analysis model called Exio-based, which is perhaps the most common internationally used. But in principle, it can be changed to another model if at some point the Statistics Sweden want to change that. So lots of the focus in the project was on emissions of greenhouse gases, but we produced results also for a range of other environmental impacts. So I'll talk about a few of these. Here first is the emissions of greenhouse gases, and I'm sorry for having this picture in Swedish. It's the latest picture taken from the Swedish EPA website. It shows the emissions from 2008 to 2019. We can see that there has been over time a slight decline. So the emissions of greenhouse gases from Swedish consumption is decreasing and has done so for some time, but of course not in a rate which is the rate which is needed to be in line with the for example, the Paris Agreement. The numbers here, it says around 10 tons per person, and it's declined to something like 9 tons per person and year in Sweden. And of course, the global average is around 5 or 6 or something like that, so we are definitely above the global average. It's also above the territorial emissions, so the emissions that occur in Sweden, they are around 5 tons per capita, most likely below. We also see here the different parts of the emissions, where they come from. The bottom here is transports, then it's food, living, other consumption, private consumption products like clothing and electronics, etc. Public consumption, and then also investments. That's real investments like in buildings and roads and railways, stuff like that, which comes with quite some emissions. So this was for greenhouse gases, and most of this occurs abroad. About a third is in Sweden, but most 2/3 approximately is from occurring in other countries. And that's quite typical for other emissions as well. Here is, for example, emissions of nitrogen oxides from Swedish consumption. It has also been slightly declining over time. And approximately 2/3 occurs in other countries and a third in Sweden. This is slightly different. This is land use from Swedish consumption. Here, the majority is actually occurring in Sweden, but some is, of course, occurring in other countries. For example, the land use from food that we are importing. Also here, there's been a slight decline. Here is an indicator where there has been no decline, and that's the total material use from Swedish consumption. Again, the majority is occurring outside Sweden in other countries. And in the project, we also developed some new indicators for chemicals, hazardous chemicals. So we developed indicators for the use of hazardous chemical products, use of pesticides, use of veterinary medicines, emissions of hazardous substances, and the impacts from those. And again, majority of the impacts occur in the rest of the world, and Sweden stands for approximately a quarter or even less. But what I think is quite interesting is that the value added, so the money that is associated with the Swedish consumption, and majority of the money ends up in Sweden. So this is, of course, interesting from an environmental justice perspective, that most of the emissions occur outside Swedish borders. The money ends up inside Sweden. So these are data for a specific year. We also developed a time series for the use of hazardous chemical products from 2013 to 2019. We can see that this is increasing, and that's interesting. Why is it increasing? Well, it's much related to buildings and associated investments. What we also see here is that, again, Sweden is the largest country, but a majority of the use of hazardous chemical products for Swedish consumption occurs in products that we import from other countries. Rather interesting, I think, is that most of these countries, most of the import comes from countries within Europe. So that means that policies within the European Union are very important also for hazardous chemical products. Of course, for example, China is important, but it's still the dark green here, but it's still a limited part. So that was about the PRINCE project. I'll now talk a little bit about project Strong Research Environment, which I led together with Åsa Svenfeldt here at KTH, but where there were a number of different researchers from different institutes involved. And we have also a number of societal partners involved. We did many things in this research program, but one of the things is that we developed scenarios. We developed 4 backcasting or target fulfilling scenarios for Sweden in 2050. And we had a range of 4 targets here, 2 environmental and 2 social targets. And the first environmental target was climate impact, so emissions of 0.82 tons of CO2, that should actually be CO2 equivalents, per capita and year. And if you remember the data I showed earlier, which was around 9 tons per person, so it means a reduction of around 90%. And this number comes from scenarios that would lead us to emissions in line with 1.5 degree target. So how large emissions could we have globally to be in line with the 1.5 degree targets? And that was then divided per capita. That could, of course, be discussed. Is per capita relevant, or should it be something else? But that was what we chose here. And then land use, also consumption-based, and also land use equally divided per capita in year. And then the first social is that all residents should be entitled to participation and influence in political choices and decision-making. And the fourth, that residents in Sweden should have sufficient access to resources and services that, to get housing, education, social care, and social security, and favorable conditions for good health. Those of you who know the Swedish constitution by heart will recognize some of these formulations. They are taken from the Swedish constitution. So based On these goals, we developed 4 backcasting scenarios for the year 2050, and they were very different. And that was the intention, to have not necessarily realistic, but very different lines of development to illustrate possible ways of reaching these different targets. One of the scenarios we call collaborative economy, so very much based on sharing economy ideas, sharing resources, having prosumer networks where you produce and consume products and services together in networks. Another one was circular economy and the welfare state, which was perhaps the scenario which is most in line with business as usual, but then of course still fulfilling the targets. Local self-sufficiency, so a scenario very much based on local self-sufficiency, household produce what they need, locally governed in locally governed communities. And the fourth, again very different, automation for quality of life, that robots produce while citizens enjoy leisure time. So here we assumed very much reduced working hours compared to the current situation. And in future scenarios, typically it is assumed that there is a constant GDP growth. But this was beyond GDP growth, and the beyond here stands for that we didn't assume a specific GDP growth. The starting point was instead the targets and how we could fulfill them, and then the GDP should be whatever it became, and could be very different in these different scenarios. So the idea is, well, these scenarios should be scenarios for sustainable building and planet that do not have to be reliant on economic growth. So we fulfill the targets. Well, here's the calculations for the CO2 emissions or greenhouse gas emissions, and we are around the green line. Here is the target, so we are around the target. Of course, large uncertainties involved here. We could talk a little bit about the different parts of the calculations. The blue at the bottom here is food. And here we assumed vegan food in all the scenarios except local self-sufficiency, where some animal-based food were included. The orange part was housing and buildings. The gray part is transportation, which is quite different in the different scenarios, but common is that car transport is very much reduced, and there was no international aviation included at all. The yellow part is other private consumption, and then public consumption, which again is very different in the different scenarios depending on the level of governance and how important governance is. Could add also that the potential negative emissions are not included here. So if there is a room for negative emissions, then that could mean an expansion of the positive emissions, so to speak, to have more animal-based food or international aviation, or perhaps even more reduced emissions. Some reflections on these scenarios: that radical changes are necessary, but also possible. There is no natural laws stopping these changes. Also, we should remember that the scenarios are for 2050, so to be in line with, for example, the 1.5 degree target, these drastic changes doesn't need to happen immediately. Technological development is key, but not enough. And interesting, different people have very different opinions about the scenarios. When we talk to people about them, many people said that only one of these scenarios is realistic or interesting. And then we talked to another person who said, oh, no, only this scenario, and then a completely different one is the only one realistic and interesting to talk about. But of course, these are just 4 scenarios out of many possible. The third program I would like to talk about is the ongoing Mr. Sustainable Consumption Program. It's currently in the first year of the second phase, and I'm program director here now in the second phase. During the first phase, it was Åsa Svenfeldt and Karin Bradley at KTH that were program directors. And I'm now leading it together with Jörgen Larsson from Chalmers. And we're approximately 20 partners from different sectors of society involved. And the point of departure here is that the current consumption practices are unsustainable, but there are sustainable niche practices. People are eating more sustainably or traveling more sustainably, but these are mainly niche practices. And of course, we want to change this so that the sustainable practices becomes mainstream. So what's stopping us? That's the part of the research. So some key contributions from phase one. We looked at the possibilities to reduce emissions now with what is available now on the market. And we only looked at food, tourists, traveling, holiday traveling, and furnitures. And by just choosing the sustainable option, we could reduce private consumption emissions by 40% with what is available now. And I think that is interesting because we often tend to talk about sustainable transitions requiring a lot of investments and technological development, but we can make significant reductions already with what is available now. But of course, it's only 40%, and we need to reduce much more. So more fundamental changes are also needed. So we're also looking at sufficiency strategies, for example, work time reduction schemes, which could enhance well-being and possibly also reduce emissions. We're also looking at business models, finding that, for example, leasing, renting, and other more sustainable business models are often appreciated from the social or functional values rather than the environmental reasons. So there's win-win options there. And also we're looking at public acceptance of policy instruments, because that is maybe necessary for politicians to dare to introduce policy instruments. And the important aspect here is fairness, that people feel that the policy instruments are fair and that they're effective, and typically also that they're targeting companies rather than private people. Other results from phase one, for example, we're looking at the potential health impact of increasing adoption of sustainable dietary practices in Sweden. So, for example, by replacing 50% of red and processed meat with vegetables and legumes, could gain up to more than 1 million life years over a longer time period. So significant health benefits, so clear win-win situations here. And we also worked, I was not directly involved myself, but we also worked with scenarios that were used as a basis for discussing new climate targets, the consumption-based targets. This was led by Jörgen Larsson from Chalmers. And they looked at emissions in scenarios for 2050 compared to 2019, different scenarios. One scenario focused on only technological changes, and that gave significant reductions, but not necessarily in line with the Paris Agreement. They also had scenarios where the focus was on only behavioral changes, and again, significant reductions. But not enough. So only by combining technological and behavioral changes, we could get reductions that were at least nearly in line with the IPCC scenarios for 1.5 degrees, without assuming significant negative emissions. So this illustrates this further. What are the changes necessary? And first of all, this range here depends on what happens in other countries. So the blue was assuming the current trends and policies in other parts of the world, whereas the orange assumes that also other parts of the world are making global climate transitions. So the technological changes, just to be quick, assuming no fossil fuels in cars and trucks, lower food production emissions, using carbon capture and storage for cement production, for example, and fossil-free steel production for the steel that is produced in Sweden and used in Sweden as well. And then behavioral changes, halving air traveling, reducing car travel, doubling public transportation, reducing housing spaces, and reduce some dietary changes, but not as drastic behavioral changes as we assumed in the Beyond GDP project, we can note, and still they can get in line with the 1.5-degree target. Some examples of some recent publications. We try to make surveys of different ways of enabling sustainable consumption, research interview overviews, etc. Useful for others. Just to be brief, I'm ending soon. I know time is running. Examples of some projects in phase 2. We're testing new practices in households that want to change, that want to be part of a transition, and also businesses looking at, for example, retail businesses, food shops, etc. What changes can they make to support the transition? We'll also look at policy experiments in municipalities and regions, continue the work on public acceptance of policies, roles of knowledge in disputes, and also looking at myths for sustainable consumption. And also looking at macroeconomic impacts of sustainable consumption and the role of offsetting, which of course needs to be discussed. Also the role of offsetting in sustainable consumption. So I'll end there. Thanks. Please check out our website. We're present on social media, and we have a newsletter which you can subscribe to. Thanks.
Thank you very much indeed. That was an absolutely excellent presentation.